Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again. I'm Joe Davich, Director of the Georgia Center for the Book, and welcome to our final panel in the 2022 Revival Lost Southern Voices Festival. A few housekeeping notes before we begin the formal presentation. We do have live transcripts turned on for our hearing impaired patrons. If you need to adjust the font in any way to make it more legible to you, please find the CC button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. And when you click it, you can modify the size of the font to suit your needs. Also, if you would like to ask the panelists a question after the formal presentation, please do so by using the Q&A feature. You'll find the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen. And when you click on it, please type in your questions there. That way we can answer them in turn. Also, in the chat section, which we'll be monitoring just in case you put a question over there, there will be a further reading list. And you can click on the links and purchase the books featured in today's sessions and all of the sessions from local independent booksellers, authors, and university presses. If you've missed any of the panels or want to review one of the panels from this year's festival, we will be posting them to the Georgia Center for the Book YouTube channel next week. I'd also like to remind you about our raffle that is taking place during this session. Please make sure that in the attendees list section that you have your first and last name visible, or please type it in the chat before a half an hour into the session when we will cut off the names for the raffle. So right now I would like to introduce our moderator for today's session, The Day Atlanta Stood Still, Atlanta and the Legacy of the Orly Plane Crash. Like the panel about the Atlanta child murders, this is going to explore how a tragedy can greatly impact a community, and specifically how it impacted the arts community here in Atlanta. Jim Auchmutey is an Atlanta journalist and the author of books including The Class of '65, A Student, A Divided Town, and The Long Road to Forgiveness, and most recently Smoke Lore, a short history of barbecue in America. He was a reporter and editor for 30 years with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he specialized in stories about Southern culture and Atlanta history. Once again, we would like to welcome you to the final panel and welcome all of our guests who are participating today. Jim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I was glad to see in that introduction that we talked a little bit about how this literary festival has traditionally dealt with writers who aren't read as much now, lost Southern voices, and how in this particular, the subject of this panel, the Orly plane crash, we're dealing quite literally with more than 100 souls from Atlanta who literally lost their voices in a tragedy. The 1962 plane crash in Paris of the arts group that was over there touring the arts capitals of Europe killed more than 100 Atlantans, and all 130 people died. It was the deadliest single plane crash in history up until that point. And it certainly left a great impact here. Let me introduce our panelists here. They both are very intimately involved with this. I'll start with Baxter Jones. Baxter is an Atlanta attorney and noted patron of the arts. He and his two siblings lost their parents in the Orly crash. Baxter was only 5 years old when it happened. But his mother's passion for art and his father's love of modernist music live on in their son, who inherited his father's record collection. Baxter is an avid collector of work by local Atlanta artists, as well as surrealistic works, and is a tireless advocate for Atlanta nonprofits. He's active in Georgia Lawyers for the Arts, and he also serves on the boards of several Atlanta arts institutions, including the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and the High Museum, both of which were profoundly affected by this tragedy we're going to be discussing. Our second panelist is Chris Moser. Chris owns the Atlanta-based production company Red Wine Productions. He's a veteran public television producer, writer, director, former news writer for CNN USA, and assistant professor emeritus of communications at Georgia State University Perimeter College. He's a 1994 recipient of the Governor's Award in the Humanities for his career achievements using media and service to that field. Chris's Georgia Public Television documentary, The Day Atlanta Stood Still, from which this panel takes its name, won a 2002 Green Ashade Award and was widely seen throughout the United States via distribution by PBS Plus. Welcome to both of you. We're not going to do distinct presentations here. I think we're just going to sort of have a conversation. I'm going to ask some questions just to sort of get things going. But I wonder if you could talk first about what was Atlanta like culturally in the late 1950s and early 1960s when this art association tour was put together. How was it different then than it is today? Either one of you can address that, whoever wants to.
Would you like to start, Baxter?
I was going to let you start. But
Oh, well, okay. Well,
covers that well.
well, Atlanta was a bustling center for transportation and communications and finance. We had the airport was growing, but it was somewhat of a, I think it's fair to say, somewhat of a cultural backwater. I mean, after all, Atlanta was not an old money city back when Hardy Ivy, the first resident of what's now Atlanta, began tilling soil, and what's now downtown Atlanta. Back then, Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans were already cultural centers. Atlanta did not have it did not have a good venue for showing art. The High Museum of Art was a tiny facility and a nondescript building. The symphony was growing. The Atlanta Symphony Orchestra was growing in reputation. It did not have a good place to perform. It was in the Atlanta Municipal Auditorium. There were theater groups coming along, but it was nowhere near major cities in the North and the Midwest as cultural centers.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. See, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you, Baxter.
Yeah, I remember going to some concerts at the old municipal auditorium, and Henry Sopkin, the symphony's director at the time, deserves a lot of credit for taking the symphony from, I think, 1945 or 6 to 66 when Robert Shaw came in. But yeah, the municipal auditorium, we also took our German Shepherd dogs there for the dog show during the day. They had live Atlanta wrestling, and they had the symphony, and they had the Scottish bagpipers and all sorts of things. So whatever deficiency Symphony Hall may have now, it sounds wonderful compared to the acoustics then. And yeah, the collection at the High was very modest at that time.
But am I correct in saying that there was a feeling among certain sort of culturally in the know people in Atlanta, and certainly among some people in the business elite and some academics, that Atlanta, if it was going to make a better name for itself, was going to need to address those cultural shortcomings and start evolving a little bit culturally. There was a sense that we needed to improve.
Absolutely. Mayor Ivan Allen, and the civic leaders who needed Atlanta to progress economically. They knew that Atlanta had to strengthen its reputation as a sports center, as a center for as a city that was progressing on the civil rights front. Of course, that Atlanta could not be a city in which the police were out bullying and terrorizing Black citizens with dogs and billy sticks and fire hoses. That we had to grow above that, and not be a city of that brought ridicule to itself before the nation and the world. and that along with that kind of economic and social progress, there needed to be progress in the cultural arena. The prominent, mostly men, of course, who were in leading politics and business, were influenced by their wives greatly, who told them if Atlanta is going to be a great city, it has to evolve culturally. And these whether or not these men knew art, they knew what they liked, and what they liked was economic growth, and they knew that growth in culture and the arts and entertainment was critical to that.
Tell me about this tour that was put together in May of 1962 that ended up in the Orly crash. This was a guided, chartered tour that was predominantly of Atlanta cultural leaders, arts leaders, people who were just interested in the arts. And what was the purpose of it?
Baxter, would you?
Well, I think, as Chris was saying, there was a movement in the late 50s, early 60s to improve Atlanta's arts scene. And I think, that was a big part of it, and to draw inspiration from some of the great European art capitals and observe and learn there. Of course, different people that went on the trip had different primary motives. Some just was a first trip to Europe for some, and wanted to spend a lot of time in museums and whatnot. But I think it was to both increase knowledge and enthusiasm, and then bring that enthusiasm back to Atlanta to help grow the art scene.
And more specifically, there was a referendum coming up to build an art center in Piedmont Park, and so there was going as part of the PR for that drive to bring more attention to the arts, favorable attention, and the need for it. The High Museum, which was trying to strengthen itself, upgrade the High into a first-class, professionally run museum. The board decided that it would organize this tour to take people to Europe, let them view the great classic artworks throughout the continent, throughout Europe, and come back with renewed enthusiasm for building up the arts, the visual arts in particular, in Atlanta.
And Chris, as you mentioned earlier, this was also sort of a parallel movement to what was going on at the same time and trying to attain big league professional sports for Atlanta. You also had business elite and political leadership then who were putting a lot of energy into trying to woo a Major League Baseball team to coming to Atlanta. It was kind of these parallel tracks of cultural growth and trying to become literally a big league city in sports. They were trying to put Atlanta on the map. And so it was this whole effort of civic striving. And one other piece of context, we forget how small Atlanta was then. Atlanta had just turned 1 million people in 1959. It was about 1/6 the size of Metro Atlanta now. It was like Memphis and Birmingham. It was basically an overgrown, striving southern city, and resembled them much more, accepting in some of its attitudes and striving than it did what we see around us now.
Indeed.
That's true. Yeah, traffic was fairly light, and Buckhead resembled a lot of Georgia small town centers. It was a sleepy little outpost.
Absolutely. Tell me, the tour started in early May, and I believe they went to London and Amsterdam and Rome, and I think it started and ended, of course, in Paris. Tell me about some of the people who were on the tour. Either one of you,
Well,
Baxter, you can tell me about your parents, but Chris can give us the overview, and then perhaps
okay, the
Baxter can talk
overview
about his
there,
parents.
there were, of course, just about everybody among those over 100 Atlantans. There were mostly Atlantans, almost all Georgians, a couple of three people from other states, Alabama. They were many of them, about half of them, were members of the Heim Museum. The others joined the museum, became members in order to get the bargain trip to Europe and join in. But many of them were community leaders, like Baxter and Julia Jones, Baxter's parents, Roby and Louise Robinson, Catherine Bleckley, a Supreme Court clerk, Georgia Supreme Court clerk, Henrietta Eyre, Rayford Ragsdale, Thomas and Charlotte Little, Thomas, the state historic architect, and his wife, Delbert Page, the leader of the group. And there were also 13 artists, actual artists aboard too. There was Helen Seidel, there was Doug Davis, who had painted portraits of a couple of presidents. There was a young, budding, growing artist named William David Coughlin. There was Louise Turner from Marshallville, who is best known as the camellia artist, but also she most loved painting small town scenes and portraits of people in her small town, especially mostly Black people. And so there were artists aboard as well as art patrons, collectors, and community leaders in different areas of different civic arenas.
Baxter, why don't you tell us about your parents?
Yeah. Well, my mother was an artist, a serious one. She got her MFA during the 40s, during the war, from the Art Institute of Chicago. And she did a lot of portraits and still lifes. I think Cézanne was a big favorite of hers, and you can see that influence sometimes in her work. My father, I don't want to go too long in this, but he did do some significant things in the legal and political worlds. He was born in Macon, went to Emory for college and law school. In the late 40s, while a partner in one of the major law firms, taught business law 1 or 2 nights a week at what was then Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta. And in 1950, he successfully led the statewide campaign to keep the county unit system out of the state constitution and therefore out of the general election. If anyone out in the audience wants to know about the county unit system in detail, I'll be glad to answer questions later in the program.
Well, let's tell them what it was. Let's tell them what it was, just in quick overview. Okay.
Just a quick overview. It was a way to keep Atlanta down. Each county had a certain number of county unit votes. The effect of it was that someone in a small rural county, their vote weighed about 30 times that of someone in Fulton County. Jimmy Carter wrote a book about it called Turning Point, in which he, as others have said it was, among other things, the bedrock of white supremacy in Georgia. And a lot of successful statewide politicians would brag that they'd never carried a county with a streetcar in it because they didn't need to. They could actually win with a minority of the vote. So he then in 52 ran against the incumbent 5th District Congressman Davis, and my father in the Democratic primary, which ran on the county unit system. And my father won the popular vote. And he had substantial support from some of the Black voters in Atlanta, but he lost the county unit vote because he carried Fulton by a large margin and narrowly lost to Calvin and Rockville. 10 years later, in 1962, that system was declared unconstitutional. There was a Supreme Court opinion, and Charles Weltner, who once told me he thought of my father as a mentor for him, was elected to Congress from the 5th District and went on to be the only Southern congressman to vote for the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Another person who got elected for the first time in 1962 was Jimmy Carter to the state Senate. And he went on from there.
So your parents were on that trip because your mother was an artist.
Yeah.
They were both collectors. And
I'm sorry I failed to mention her among the artists, but yes.
Yeah, they were enthusiastic about music and art, and they had really just started what you might call serious art collecting, shortly before that trip. And so he was 43, she was 41 at the time.
they were young. Okay, so the tour, from everything I've read, it sounds like it was wonderful. Everybody was having a good time. And here on Sunday, June 3rd, 1962, they're getting ready to come back home, literally taking off, headed back across the Atlantic to Atlanta when this tragedy happens. Chris, why don't you take it from there? Tell us what actually happened that day with the flight.
Well, the plane took off down the runway, and then as Milton Bevington was describing it, Milton's wife and mother-in-law were on the plane. He flew over to surprise them, but he made a separate plane reservation back because they were afraid. They had children and they were afraid to fly together in case something like that happened. And so he was in the terminal watching the plane take off and roll down the runway, and suddenly saw white smoke coming up from the runway, and the plane went out of sight. And what happened was there was a mechanical problem which a pilot reacted to erroneously, apparently, and the plane crashed on takeoff. And everyone was killed other than two flight attendants who were in the back and escaped unscathed, walked away from it. There was a third flight attendant who was mortally injured, died in the hospital. And the plane went up in flames, and we understand that everyone else died instantly in the crash.
And when news of this came back to Atlanta, it was basically when? Late, it was like as people were getting out of church about that time?
Late Sunday morning.
Late Sunday
many
morning.
people were in church. Aubrey Morris recalls that he was in church on that Sunday morning. Some people were on the way, and then the first reports came in by AP and UPI and hit the radio airwaves that morning.
Aubrey Morris was a veteran radio reporter for WSB and kind of a legendary figure for people who grew up in Atlanta during those periods. Had a very distinctive voice. Baxter, you were only 5 years old. How did you find out about this?
Well, I was told by my aunt and uncle. They told my sister and my brother and me. 20 years ago at the 40th anniversary of this, they had a meeting with the time that the documentary was made and Ann Abram's book came out. And that's where I learned for the first time that several other people who were orphaned by the crash had really terrible experiences. That's talked about in the documentary. Some people, no one would be forthright with them and tell them what happened. And then they wound up with relatives they didn't like. My aunt and uncle, my mother's brother and his wife, who did not have children of their own and who we were already close to, basically stepped in and were our wonderful second parents from that time on. So they were, I think that was a good practice to tell us in terms that young people can understand, but honestly, what had happened.
But Chris, I take it that a lot of people, some of the people and people who were in your documentary had much more, I think, sort of immediately traumatic ways of finding out. Talk a little bit about how the news hit Atlanta and how some of the families dealt with this.
Well, there was a couple, the Reynolds children, the older girl tried to protect his brother from seeing the news before she could break it to her, but he was watching cartoons on TV, and then the bulletin broke in, interrupting that broadcast and told the news. And so he found out about it before she could come in and break it to him gently. And he just went running out of the house up the hill to a neighbor's in hysterics. There was the children of an attorney named Reuben Krim, is a famous, well-known Jewish attorney, and they were whisked away when the news first came out. Their family and an uncle took them to the country club swimming to kind of postpone and figure out how to deal with this, and then brought them back home to the house. And the crowd of people were there, then relatives and friends at the house when the family drove back up with the children. And a rabbi said to the little boy, said, something has happened and your parents are not coming right now. And the little boy said, well, when are they coming home? And the older sisters just screamed at him, don't you understand that they're never coming home? So there are moments like that happening all to children all over Atlanta and outside of Atlanta. So many of them were orphaned.
I think in the film you say that there were 42 children under 18 who lost one or two parents.
That's correct.
Yeah, it's awful.
And in the years that followed, when they went into different families, they were back then there was not the kind of sophistication in mental health counseling for children that there is now, and people who came into custody of those children did their best to raise them and to deal with their grief, but they really didn't know how. And in many cases, their parents were just never spoken of anymore, and they didn't know how to help the children process their grief. And one of the most moving experiences that I had in making the film was an occasion when many of the adult children, Baxter, you were there, or they were brought together at the Woodruff Arts Center to meet each other, many for the first time, and share their experiences about it with each other. And some of them came out saying things like, this is the first time I realized that I'm not a freak, that there are other people who went through the same experiences that I did of grief and of trauma and of living in environments in which people didn't know how to deal with that trauma.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things about the reaction to the crash was that Ivan Allen Jr. had been mayor of Atlanta only a few months when this happened, and he knew a lot of the people who were in this crash, and he immediately got on a plane and went to Paris. And I think you have an excerpt from the documentary, Chris, that you were going to show us about some of Ivan Allen Jr.'s experiences over there, which are very poignant.
Yes, let me see if we can bring that up. Let's see. Give me a moment, please, because I've never done this before. Allow, and are we seeing it on the screen?
Yes, looks good. Mhm.
At City Hall, Mayor Allen announced that he and City Attorney Edwin Stern would fly to Paris that afternoon.
This strikes so deeply in Atlanta that I feel that part of the official family of Atlanta should be there.
As stunned Atlantans bought newspaper extras on Peachtree Street, WSB decided to send Aubrey Morris with Allen and Stern to cover the story. When they arrived in Orly and were met by the mayor of Paris, Allen immediately asked to visit the crash site.
Still the smoldering wreckage of the Air France jet line, the personal possessions of the passengers strewn over a large area. Several houses nearby had been clipped by the wings of the plane as it came in to crash. Firemen were still on the scene. French police had the place cordoned off. Everything had been done to remove the bodies that had been there. But we went out to the ruins, and there were evidence of some of their remains still there. For instance, I found what I thought was the type of skirt that Nancy Frederick had worn when in Atlanta.
The mayor also spotted a necktie that he himself had purchased as a Christmas gift to one of the men who had died in the crash. And he found a charred portion of a travel brochure for the art tour, reading in part, "Your trip will be carefree and unforgettable." It crumbled in his hand.
Yeah, that's really riveting. There were
And I'd like to add, Jim, that
Yes, please,
that
Chris.
after leaving the scene, that then the mayor went around to the different morgues to try to identify these horribly charred bodies, and it took such courage and character to do that, as Aubrey said in the film. He didn't have to do that, but he wanted to report back to the families anything that he could, and so he put himself through that horrifically traumatic experience. Ivan Allen emerged as the protagonist of the story to me as it evolved, and as the story took shape. He was, I think, a magnificent figure, and my film in part turned out to be my love letter to him, as well as to the bereaved children of all those victims. But I just want to say that Mayor Allen is a magnificent figure in Atlanta history. A good friend of mine and a partner on another project I'm doing, David Hughes Duke, produced an excellent documentary, GPB, Georgia Public Broadcasting documentary on Mayor Allen, which I recommend to everyone.
Let me say something about the general reaction to the crash. There were condolences that came in from President John F. Kennedy, I believe Eleanor Roosevelt, Scarlett O'Hara herself, Vivian Lee. There were all these expressions of sympathy that came in from far and wide. As you mentioned before, this was right in the middle of the civil rights movement. The sit-in movement had started just in the last 2 years. And it's interesting, there were two divergent reactions from that area. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, an Atlanta native, and Harry Belafonte called off plans for a sit-in in downtown Atlanta out of respect for the tragedy. On the other side of the country, Malcolm X, who was just starting to make a name for himself, said that basically he heard that a bunch of white people had gotten killed in a plane crash and that they were from Georgia, and that pleased him because his grandfather had been enslaved in Georgia and it served him right. So there were a lot of strong feelings going around and different reactions to it. Let's talk about, first of all, the reaction the French had. The French were very grief-stricken on the behalf of Atlanta, and they loaned a fairly serious, famous piece of art to be displayed in Atlanta, exhibited in Atlanta, that a lot of the people who were on this plane had just recently seen. Tell us about becoming a Whistler's mother to Atlanta.
Baxter?
Either one of you.
Well, the shade, Rodin's The Shade, was an expression of grief, and once the Memorial Arts Center was completed, which is later part of the story, the French government donated that piece of art to Atlanta, and it was donated as a memorial to those people.
Yeah, and Jim, I think, is referring to the loan of Whistler's mother to
okay.
shortly after. And this version I heard was initially there was some talk of him loaning the Mona Lisa, but that turned out, just something that didn't happen. But it drew a lot of people to see Whistler's mother.
Hey, Baxter, that was the first serious piece of artwork I ever viewed. When I was 7 years old, my family went down to Midtown to see Whistler's mother. And even at that age, I was aware of the fact that it had some connection to this terrible thing that had happened.
My wife and I were in Paris this past November, and we saw it at the Musée d'Orsay, and it brought back memories of when I'd heard that it had come here. In fact, a French woman who was showing us around said, "Oh, there's the American Mona Lisa."
Well, a lot of people, when this story is told, a lot of people sort of make it sound like Atlanta's grief over what happened in this crash led directly to the building of the Memorial Arts Center and to us becoming a more serious cultural center. But there were some fits and starts before that. The referendum that Chris was talking about that was on the ballot, like only a couple of months after the Orly crash, it didn't do so well, did it?
No, it was voted down, and there was a racial angle to the defeat of that, a whisper campaign going around. As I understand, which people said, if there's an art center, a cultural center in Piedmont Park, which is integrated, then Black people will be there, and we can't have that, can we? And that was Baxter. Is that your understanding too? That was probably a significant one of the significant reasons that referendum went down.
Yeah, my understanding, that some no votes came from people with just that fear that they were afraid it would be integrated. And then my understanding is there were some Black voters who voted against it because they thought it maybe would not be. So, yeah.
And remember that then when this crash happened and when this referendum occurred a few months later, that segregation was still legal. This was before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, so this was the law in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. And Baxter, maybe you could comment on, talk about how getting back to the county unit system and how that held besides holding Atlanta down specifically, it also held black voters down, did it not?
Well, very, very much so. Very much so. There, I mean, most of the registered black voters in Georgia were in and around Atlanta. And their votes didn't count for much, statewide. So after the county unit system was abolished, then it mattered more. Yeah.
And Baxter, would you maybe we could talk a bit about the relationship between racially progressive politics and arts and culture. I mean, there's kind of the same, what brought the same people to share those values.
Well, I think that tends to be true. Yeah. I mean, the arts are a way of exploring, what people have in common ultimately, and that obviously applies to understanding across different racial groups.
And it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, that that economic progress in Atlanta was not going to be possible without racial progress.
Right, of course.
Well,
And cultural progress.
tell me then, if the referendum failed in late 1962, then how did it get turned around? How did the Memorial Arts Center come to be after the voters turned down a cultural center like that?
Well, that's traced out in some detail in Ann Abrams' book. I don't know if we've mentioned it, this one, but it's partly thanks to a dedicated group of fundraisers, and Mr. Robert Woodruff played a key role in the background, providing, I think, half the money to get the center built.
Woodruff had pledged $4 million to the cultural center in Piedmont Park had that happen.
Yep.
And then when it was defeated, he was, I'm sure, quite disgusted and withdrew his money. But then a few months after that, the Art Association board chair, Jimmy Carmichael, received a message from Woodruff that he might still pledge the $4 million as a challenge grant, this time if the art center were on non-city property and if it would memorialize the Atlantans lost at Orly.
Yeah, Woodruff.
And so that started a fundraising campaign that had to be matched, and then the cost estimates went up, and it was looking bleak, but there was a campaign that went on there for from 1964 for the next couple of years or so into 1966, and it was touch and go there for a while.
Yep.
And then finally the Callaway Foundation came in with the last $1 million that pushed it over the top, the drive over the top.
But it was fundraising and grants. It was not a referendum.
It was not a referendum. It was large grants, and it was nickels and dimes too. It was thousands of volunteers scouring the city and the suburbs, raising funds. School children made and solicited donations in something called Operation Button Week. The symphony brought Jack Benny to town as a guest violinist for a benefit concert. And so it was big money and it was little money. It was grassroots as well.
I think a lot of people may not know that the land where the Art Center is now, it was really the High Museum and the Art School were there in that area, in some buildings that were nice old houses. The symphony, as we've mentioned, was downtown, and there were several theaters scattered around. And the Alliance Theater is actually the successor to the first theater that opened in that building in 1968, which had a very expensive and impressive production that unfortunately bankrupted the first theater that operated there. But the Alliance came in a year or two after that and has gone on to be one of the leading national theaters. So yeah, I remember going to the dedication in 1968 of the new building at that time, which, you know, at that time was a major step forward in facilities. By 1983, when the Richard Meyer designed building opened, you know, that one again was a quantum leap in certainly what the High had as far as galleries.
There's a story that when the architect first delivered the sketches for the Memorial Arts Building, went to Mr. Woodruff and he looked at it and he said, "This is not grand enough. There should be columns." So,
Where are the columns?
yeah, or the columns. So the art director, the architect took it back and said, "Okay, we'll draw in columns," and he put in columns, and so Mr. Woodruff looked at it and saw that it was good.
And you mentioned the sculpture earlier, the Rodin sculpture, the shade. I think most people on this Zoom meeting probably know a little bit about it, but tell me again what the significance of that sculpture is, both as a tribute and both in terms of what it artistically depicts.
Well, it's a human form that's bent in grief, and it was a rare bronze casting of Auguste Rodin's sculpture. And during the first evening of the ceremonies, the French ambassador Charles Lucé unveiled it, and he said he characterized it as representing the reconciliation of death and destiny. It was inside the building for many years on a landing going between first and second floors, and then in the 1990s it was moved out to its present location outside between the original Memorial Arts Building and the High Museum in a ceremony in 95, I believe.
Baxter, you were when we were talking earlier, you were telling me that usually when you hear the story of the Orly plane crash, it's told in terms of how it galvanized Atlanta's artistic ambitions, cultural ambitions. But you also told me that you thought in some ways that it had set us back because we lost some very valuable people, particularly some people who would have been important collectors here. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that narrative is partly true or mostly true, that it did galvanize getting a lot of things done. And that's true. However, there's certain areas, and the number one, I think, is in art collecting. I think we were set back a couple decades. I'm on the collections committee at the High Museum, and, the last 20, 25 years, the museum still doesn't have a lot of money to buy acquisitions, but the good news is they get wonderful gifts from people's collections, sometimes entire collections being given. And that was happening in other similar sized American cities in the 60s and 70s and 80s in a way that it was not happening here. And I think, my parents, it's hard to know exactly what certain people would have done had they lived another 20 or 30 years. But, my parents were just starting to collect around the same age I was when I started. I think they would have gone on to do a good bit. There was a man named Sidney Wien, am I pronouncing that right? W-I-E-N, who was a serious collector. He was on the acquisitions committee of the High. Now, he was 60 at the time of the crash, which may not sound like a young collector, but I'm 64, and I think I've got several more good years of collecting and helping the museums ahead of me. And I could name a lot of people who are in the 70s and 80s and even 90s who are, continue to make a big difference in the visual arts in Atlanta. But there really was a time in the 60s and 70s when, like Goodman Victel came in about a year later in 1963. And for that most of that decade in the 70s, he did most of the work. He didn't really have full-time curators. There were some professors like Clark Poling and John Howitt, and who were Emory professors who did some guest curating. Dr. Poling, actually, I took the course that he taught in art history at Emory, and his field was surrealism, so I think he was an influence on me at that time. But I made some notes on just the first full-time curators came into Atlanta in late 1979. Peter Moran in 20th Century Art and Eric Jeff in European Art. Donald Pierce in Decorative Art arrived the next year with Judy Larson in 1985 for American Art. So you had this period where you didn't even have really full-time dedicated curators in a lot of these fields. And I think there's several people in that group who would have accelerated some of the developments in that, and help account for the fact that in the 80s and 90s, while we made great progress with the symphony and in the theater community and in like the buildings and exhibitions at museums like the High, the permanent collection for a long time lagged. And the permanent collection has improved enormously in the last 30 years, and I'm excited to help play a role in that. But, I think that's a part of the narrative that doesn't quite always get picked up.
Yeah, compared to the great cities of in the North, in the Midwest, Atlanta is a new money city, and new money doesn't tend to support arts the way old money does. And the kind of people that we were talking about earlier, Baxter's parents, the Robinsons, others, Crims, these were what there was, I guess, they more represented what there was of old money, and people with cultural and refinement and interest in the arts in Atlanta at that time. And who knows what we lost when we, in support of the arts, when we lost them, as well as some of the artists themselves, like Baxter's mother, and like the others, that dozen or so other artists who were actually on the plane. What greatness might they as individual artists have achieved?
Right, that's an excellent point too. And I think, art collecting, while some people go off and do it completely on their own, it tends to, most of the time, be kind of a activity where you get a critical mass of people who influence each other. Someone will say, go down to Sandler Hudson and see this exhibit. I think you'll really like it. And so obviously, if you take a number of people who would have exercised that kind of influence out, it had an negative impact.
Do y'all think Atlanta's growth as a cultural center would have evolved differently without this tragedy?
I think it would have been a little different. Yeah. I guess you wouldn't have a memorial arts center. It's hard to be sure if, the Woodruff Arts Center as we know it would exist, putting visual, symphony and theater, and for a while the art school together in one place. It's hard to know whether that would have happened, but a lot of things would have happened, I think.
No way to know. One of the bereaved children, one of the children of victims, Susan Kofer, made the comment. She said it would be interesting in control of history if we could be in control of history and figure out what would have happened if history hadn't eliminated all those people. What would the city be like? Would we be much more excited about art and much more passionate about art? Did we lose the best people, or did we crack open the nut and allow the seed to grow? And of course, it's impossible to answer that, but I do think it's important to always remember that the people who died on that crash contributed to our progress in culture in Atlanta, not just by their tragic deaths, but by their lives, their outstanding, splendid lives.
Do you think the memory of this event and its legacy is as strong now?
Well, I doubt the memory is as strong, but perhaps the legacy is.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree. But most people who go through the Arts Center now and other various locations in which there were smaller memorials scattered around the city pass by those sculptures and those other artifacts and have no idea what they're memorializing. And so we were glad in our GPB film to draw as much attention to the story as we could.
And I do think the Art Center has done a good job in the way they've placed the Rodin Sculpture. And a lot of times I walk by there and I see one or two people are over there, reading the information that's there. So
They have all the names there of the people who perished, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and they have a brief description of what happened. So, yeah. So that's a good step.
Well, I wonder if we have any questions. I have to say, folks, I have not been monitoring it because I've been talking too much.
We do have a few in the chat, Jim,
Yes.
and we have a few in the Q&A section. Do you want me to go ahead and pull those up for you?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Sure. Okay, a quick couple here. One of them from Pearl asks, Baxter, how, if at all, is your arts philanthropy connected to the crash and loss of your parents and any other arts patrons? And she further asks to both of you, Chris and Baxter, what would you want this audience to do regarding reviving these lost voices?
Well, they can read about them in the Abrams book, and there's some other books I could name, and I think definitely my involvement in arts organizations was very much influenced by both the example of what my parents did while they were alive and an attempt to help fill some gaps that were left afterwards.
I also would like to heartily recommend Ann's book, and Ann Yuri Abrams worked with me on the film and was invaluable in her assistance and consultation. But more broadly, I think the best way that we today can honor the memory of those wonderful people is just to patronize the arts. Certainly at the Woodruff Arts Center, but much beyond that, attend the institutions, go to plays, concerts, and art exhibits, and so forth, all over the Atlanta area and the Georgia area they have emerged so prolifically and splendidly. And as COVID recedes now, it's time and spring is coming on. Folks, go out in the evening in the daytime too for the art exhibits, and become arts patrons.
Yeah, we have some wonderful art galleries here in Atlanta, and that's never been an easy. It's always done more out of love than a desire to make a lot of money. But there's some first-rate galleries here. People should check out. Atlanta theater community has an amazing national reputation. About a dozen, 15 years ago, there was the meeting of the Theater Communications Group, which is the umbrella group for nonprofit theaters in America. And it met in Atlanta at the Woodruff Arts Center. And I think a lot of Atlantans would have been amazed and gratified to hear these people from Boston, from Minneapolis, from San Francisco, talking about, how theater companies like Horizon and Actors Express and Theatrical Outfit, how highly regarded they are, not to mention the Alliance, around the country. And of course, the Atlanta Symphony has an international reputation, and we're very excited by the new music director, Natalie Stutzman, French woman who'll be taking over in the fall. There.
And the art scene is not only outstanding in its quality, but it's in its diversity, the ethnic diversity, the strength of African American arts and culture, and Hispanic and Asian, and so forth.
Yeah, the Spelman College Museum is an excellent place. The Carlos Museum out of Emory. We could go on for a while.
So there's a lot of comments in the chat section, of course, people with remembrances and talking about how they knew people and sort of like connections that way. We do have someone, Lynn, is asking Chris if you would talk a bit about your process of making the documentary, and several folks would like to know also where they could view it as well.
Well, the second question first. It's easy to view online. Just go on and Google GPB, The Day Atlanta Stood Still, and it will come right up. And the process of making it stretched about 5 years, and it was a labor of love. At first, a private company originally was interested in doing it and hired me. I was freelancing at that point after a number of years at Public Broadcasting Atlanta on staff. And then that company on spec invested some production resources, and we started shooting interviews. And then that company lost its backer and had to pull out, and I was on my own, but we did have several interviews done, especially with several of the adult children. And with Allen himself, the mayor gave me the last film interview, television interview that he ever did, because at that time he realized that his mental faculties were slipping, and he had stopped doing it, but he did that for me, I'm proud to say. And so I just kept plugging away at it and trying to raise funds for it until my late lamented dear friend George Goodwin, a great civic leader, persuaded GPB to come into the project with me, and working with the Woodruff Arts Center, we were able to raise the rest of the funds I needed to complete it. But the process was I just kept researching and working with Yuri Abrams, and from the interviews began crafting the story, and the story just wrote itself. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, you did an excellent job, Chris. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. it's a credit to Mayor Allen and to people like yourselves, the children of the victims and other relatives of the victims, who touched me so deeply with their interviews. And I just realized this had to be completed to tell this story. And those individuals who shared this collective grief and pain and trauma, and who in most cases emerged from it to be such strong individuals, they became one of the great inspirations of my life. And I always treasure the memory of meeting and working with all of them in the process of making this film, which is my proudest achievement in my career.
Well, Chris, you also quickly mentioned a few other memorials other than La Sombra that's at the Memorial Arts Center. What other memorials, big or small, are there around Atlanta?
There is there at Agnes Scott College, there's a sculpture called Icarus. That's a memorial. There's a stained glass window in St. Philip's Cathedral in Buckhead, overlooking the street. The Center Stage Theater was built originally as a memorial to Helen Cartledge, one of the victims. Those are three that immediately come to mind.
Thank you so much. Jim, anything else as we're getting close to the top of the end of our time here?
No, I just want to thank our panelists and thank everybody for tuning in. If we don't have any other questions, this has always been such an interesting story to me, and it's been a real pleasure to hear somebody who produced the definitive video history of it and whose life was so touched by it as Baxter talk about all this. I appreciate it.
I'd like to just say hello to someone who just popped up in the chat. Carol Fisk was my executive producer at GPB for this. Thank you, Carol, so much for all you did. You deserve a lot of credit.
Hi, Carol.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Jim, for your wonderful job moderating this panel. Chris and Baxter for sharing this story with us and sharing your personal stories as well. Just a reminder, of course, we will be posting this video and the videos from the other sessions from Lost Southern Voices 2022 next week on the Georgia Center for the Book YouTube channel. We'll also be contacting the winner of this final raffle today. We hope you've had a wonderful time, not only at this panel, but if you've been able to attend the other panels for the last 3 days. We hope you have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you for Revival Lost Southern Voices 2023, where we'll unearth and bring to light some other lost, erased, and marginalized voices, either of writers or artists. Thank you so much for participating, and have a wonderful night, everyone.